My name's André La Gerche. I'm a cardiologist at St Vincent's and the head of the Heart Lab, the research program. Many of you will know that because it's sort of and the main reason for tonight is kind of to say thank you to the whole community of research participants for our studies. Before COVID, we fairly regularly had some sort of feedback sessions where we talked about what we were doing, what our most recent research showed. And then through COVID, that sort of stopped. And we kind of just recently we were thinking we're getting a lot out, and particularly the main AF, which was the main AF study, which I'll get to, but which was the main reason we thought we need to get the news back out there, etc. So that's what tonight's about. It's predominantly slash entirely about sort of thank you and here's the information and this is what we're doing. It's also an opportunity for me to be kind of be proud of my lab and show some of the work that some of the PhD students are doing. It's nice from that perspective. And also an opportunity to highlight the international nature of our research. And I'm going to introduce Professor Guido Klaassen in just a moment. The other thing yes. You are great. Okay, good one. Which is also a good thing. So we're going to the aim here is not to speak for too long and to leave a lot of opportunity for questions. I just before even right from the outset want to thank Saba, Amy, and Caitlin that have been critical in organising tonight behind the scenes, or a lot of the correspondence with those people, and also Kathleen and Maddie, who are very involved. I don't think they're in the room to even be thanking them, but thanks to all the people that have made tonight happen. And then the other thing is, although this is very much a thank you, our research requires support, and we get support from government grants and from various things. But the two biggest supporters of our research are St Vincent's Institute and Victor Chang, which is a cardiovascular research institute in Sydney, but have sort of got an Australian reach. And can I get Tom Kay and Jason Kovacic just to stand up? That might be a bit intimidating, Tom, because Jason wins in the stand-up competition, but Tom Kay is the director of St Vincent's Institute, and Jason Kovacic is the director of the Victor Chang Cardiovascular Research Institute. And we're the first lab that they've collaborated with, two research institutes to support our research. And so we're very grateful because the most important kind of funding that we get is, if you like, the sort of block funding or the don't have to fight for it kind of funding. And so we get a lot of our support through both of those institutes. Jason's also a former elite national rower who rode for Merck. So some of you might know Jason from right, and then spent a lot of time in New York and then back to Sydney. Don't completely understand why he went to Sydney rather than Melbourne, but we won't hold that against him tonight. Now, if tonight's not about philanthropy, but we do also rely on people's funding. So if you've got a friend who's got sort of money that they need to spend at tax time next year, then I can tell you that St Vincent's Institute and Victor Chang support fantastic research and a good place to do those things. There's some information here about our lab, but partly my job's to convince you tonight just how that our research is doing good things. Now, as I said, a lot of our research is about international collaboration. Our biggest athlete study is Pro at Heart and Pro AF Heart, and also it's been growing. I was going to say metastasizing, but that's cancer research. It's been growing, and we've got Master at Heart, Elite at Heart, everything at Heart. And a lot of that's happening either here or through Belgium, and we're involved. We're in each other's. We meet sort of every 4 weeks by Zoom with the whole Belgian team. And we've been lucky that Guido Klaassen was one of my PhD students when I was in Belgium. He's become a full-blown professor and leader of cardiovascular research in Belgium. So I thought I'd get Guido to speak a little bit about some of the work that they're doing or we're doing in collaboration and or they're doing in Belgium along the same themes. And then I'd come back and talk about Pro at Heart. Now, the other thing is, Guido's been very good with his time, but he's here with his young family and they're virtually finishing and then going to the plane. So I'm going to get Guido to speak and then get him to run. And I'll address all the questions and things from Guido. Yeah, but it's very special thanks because even tonight running by a tight timeline, I've probably even made it tighter. So Guido, thank you very much.
Yeah, I just also want to thank Andre again for the opportunity and the whole lab for, especially Saab also for having a fantastic organization. And I share Andre's enthusiasm when it comes to having these small conferences in which we have the opportunity to really feed back to the people that really make our research, because without the volunteers, we wouldn't be able to examine all the things we like to examine and for which we have the passion to investigate. So thank you as well. I will be talking today about the relationship between exercise training and the development of coronary artery disease or coronary artery clogging. Now just to give you the full context in my regular practice, I'm both a sports cardiologist, but at the same time, I do cardiac rehab. And so in the majority of cases, I actually prescribe exercise as one of the best possible therapies for treating patients with cardiac disease. And that's a really important cornerstone of the management. I think it's very important to have this context because often following the media, you get the impression like exercise is bad, etc. It's quite the opposite. So that's very important to put clear from the start. But having said so, there have been concepts over the last decades that there might exist such a thing as too much exercise in some individuals, and that can actually present itself on three aspects. If you look at the heart, we have the electricity, we have the mechanics, which is actually the pump function, and when we have the vessels that kind of perfuse the heart and that deliver the oxygen, which is obviously necessary for the heart to perform its pumping function. And when there's clogging or when there's obstruction in these vessels that perfuse the heart muscle, people can develop myocardial infarction. That's when problems arise. And that's specifically the area that I will talk about in this brief presentation. So as a sports cardiologist, one of our main tasks is to identify the individuals that may be at risk of developing acute, so sudden cardiac problems, especially related to that may predispose for sudden events, either on the sporting run, but also outside of the sporting arena. And if we look at the incidence, so the chance of the risk of developing sudden cardiac death related to sport, then there's some important observations. First of all, that's a very important one, is that it's a rare event. So it doesn't occur very frequently, but it does occur, unfortunately, and it depends, like the specific causes of these events, they are dependent on the age of the individual. So at a young age, it's mainly inherited disease of the heart muscle or of the electricity, whereas at an older age, and especially from the age of 35, as you can see in this figure, it's mainly related to the heart vessels. So that's what we call atherosclerotic artery disease or coronary artery pathology, meaning clogging or obstruction of the vessels that perfuse the heart muscle. And that's really, as I mentioned, the focus of this talk. So I'll mainly focus on that area. Now, there have been one of the important questions that has been raised over the past decade is whether exercise, and particularly high intensity, high volume exercise like endurance exercise, rowing, cycling, running, etc., whether that can affect the vessels that perfuse the heart muscle. And we can actually assess these vessels using heart scans that we use in daily practice. And this is an example of a coronary CT to derive what we call coronary calcium score. It's complex wording, but actually what we look at is we look at the coronary vessels, the heart vessels, and specifically what we look at is the buildup of calcium in the wall of these vessels, and that appears as whitish touched, just like the skeleton, like the ribs, etc. And you see this is expressed as a calcium score, which is 0. It means there's no calcium, which is the best possible scenario. And then as we move along towards higher scores, you see that there is more whitening in these vessel walls. So meaning there is more calcium, there is more disease, so to speak, of the coronary vessels. And so the first investigation that really brought this association between exercise and development of coronary atherosclerosis to light is this German study. So they compared about 100 marathon runners and then 200 risk score matched controls. So they had similar proportion of high blood pressure, cholesterol, etc. And they used a heart scan, so this type of scan, to check for this calcium in the vessel wall. And actually their idea from beforehand was that athletes would perform better, that they would have a lower risk of this calcium buildup in the wall. But actually, contrary to what they proposed in the beginning, is that they actually saw the opposite. So the runners, they were more likely to have higher calcium scores, so meaning more calcium deposits in the vessel wall. Also, this was not entirely benign. So those athletes that had these higher calcium scores, they also had more likely cardiac events, such as, for example, a myocardial infarction. So this was a bit controversial because we know, and that's again an important message, that if you do regular exercise, you actually live longer, you have lower chances of developing cardiac disease. But then how do we explain these results? Because we know that the fittest people around, they seem to have a higher chance of developing this calcium buildup. And that's where I think we have to really interpret the results very carefully. And if you look at this particular study, we noticed that 50% of these athletes, previously they were smoking, and even 5% was still smoking at the time of the study. So an important message is here, it's not because you're well-performing athletes that you're immune to the cardiovascular risk factors. And so if you smoke, if you have high blood pressure, then even then, despite being an active athlete, you can develop cardiac problems. However, over the course of time, the green study is the German study, but also other studies, including, as you see on the far right, the Belgian study, have kind of validated these findings. And I'll zoom in a little bit on the gray bars, which is the Master at Heart study that we performed as well. We specifically investigated the same hypothesis, so we performed heart scans in healthy individuals, and we counted for cardiac risk factors. So none of the persons that entered our study could have one of the traditional cardiac risk factors. So none of the individuals had high blood pressure, diabetes, high cholesterol, etc. And we compared 3 groups, so controls, late onset athletes, and lifelong athletes. So the late onset athletes, these are the individuals that started only after the age of 30. We often label them as the midlife crisis athletes. So they started only at a later age. And then we have the lifelong athletes, which are people like yourself that have been sporting like since a very young age and that are still active at the moment of the study. And when we performed a heart scan, we found very similarly that the chances of having this higher calcium score, despite absence of risk factors, again, was more prevalent, was more common in the lifelong athletes. We also looked at plaques. So plaques is it's calcium buildup as well in the vessel wall. It's actually looking at the same thing, but it gives some more information. We give contrast through a anticubital vein. It goes to the heart and it enables us to look a bit into more detail of the deposits that occur in the vessel wall. But actually the results are very similar. So if we look again at the gray mastered heart study, we see that the likelihood of having at least one plaque was actually higher in the lifelong athletes compared to the controls. Now, just to give you the context, because that's very important, the controls that we had, this was an extremely healthy group. They couldn't have any cardiovascular risk factor, and also generally they were physically active. So it was actually quite hard to do better than this group. This context is very important, because I'm sure that if we would have compared the lifelong athletes to sedentary people with cardiac risk factors, the athletes would have definitely done better. And this is actually the hypothesis or the current understanding that we have if we look at imaging data, so data from heart scans being performed in the wide community, is that if you are sedentary, so if you don't do anything in terms of physical activity, if you have a sedentary lifestyle, often also have risk factors like smoking, high blood pressure, so you perform worse. So you have the highest likelihood of having what we call clogging of the heart arteries. If you stick to the general recommendations by the WHO, then you are at the best possible scenario, the lowest likelihood of having plaques or calcium buildup in the vessels. But based on the evidence that, like the mastered heart and other studies, we do see that there seems to be some tear and wear. We don't know exactly why this occurs, that with very high volumes of exercise, there is some increased calcium buildup. Now, obviously, an important question, because I called this high volume, high intensity exercise, but what is driving this? Is it exercise intensity, so the participation in the high exercise heart rate zones, or is it more just the total duration of exercise? And that's very important, because athletes like yourself, they often come with the CT scan and they say, what can I continue to do? And so in sports cardiology, we have been very poor in assessing actually the training load of these individuals up till now. And that's mainly because it's very hard to look at all of these training files, especially if you look at several hundreds of athletes that participate in trials. And up till now, all of the trials, all of the studies so far, they looked at questionnaires, particularly just asking the individuals like, how many hours of sports do you do? And how many hours of sports have you been doing since the age of 6 years old? Which, as you can imagine, is quite an inaccurate way of assessing the exercise training load, because the more recreational athletes, they often overestimate the amount of training they've been doing, and the elite athletes, they often kind of underestimate a little bit. So we thought a better way of looking at this training load was to really look at the wearable data, so the training that was actually documented by using heart rate monitors, especially wearing the chest strap to look at heart rates. And so we wanted to look at the relationship between actual training loads and the development of this clogging in the coronary artery to have the best possible objective relationship. And here I show you just the quartiles, so the differences in the amount of time that the participants spend in the high training zone, so training zone 4 and 5, so meaning the really high intensity training. Q1 means the lowest proportion of high intensity training, and Q4 are the individuals that really spend most of the time in the high intensity training zones. And on the vertical axis, you see the probability that these individuals have plaques. And what you can see is actually that there is no relationship. So whether or not these individuals performed a lot of time in the high intensity training zones, it didn't matter. It didn't make any difference. So apparently from these data, whether you exercised very vigorously or less vigorously, all endurance athletes didn't really matter. What did matter is the amount of hours of training. And it's really the athletes that performed more hours of training per week that had a higher likelihood of developing clogging of the coronary arteries. And especially if you look here, so Q1 again is those athletes that performed less hours per week. So to clarify, these were not all athletes, there was also some controls that were using wearables. That's why Q1, for example, is 0.1 to 2.6 hours of training per week. And you see that those individuals at the lowest likelihood, the lowest probability of developing clogging. But even 2.6 to 5.4, that corresponds to that nadir of the curve, same story. So they didn't have an increase in clogging despite being more active. It only starts to increase at about 5.5 and especially above 8.5 hours per week. The same if you look at plaques, the same if you look at the calcium score that is not zero, or especially the calcium score that is above 100. And this calcium score above 100 is important because that's a commonly used threshold for prescribing lipid-lowering therapies like statins, etc. This is a more complex way of just showing the same message, but it just shows you that the more the amount of training increases, you have a higher likelihood of this clogging. Now, this is the final slide, and I think it's just very important to show to you as being athlete, as representing the athlete community, because as I mentioned, all of the data I've shown you, it's imaging data. It does not equate the probability of having cardiovascular events. Imaging and events is something that is not the same. Here you actually see the likelihood of having a cardiovascular event as determined by the study in the USA. And they looked at a large sample of individuals, 20,000 individuals. They used heart scans to look at this calcium score, and they also looked at fitness. And there's some important observations. The most important one is the fitter you are, the lower your likelihood of having cardiovascular events. So that's already the answer to what people often ask is like, should I stop or should I cut down on exercising? You should not, because the fitter you are, the lower your risk of cardiovascular events. But if you look at the CAC scores, we do see that if you have a CAC score that is zero, so low CAC, so it is the calcium buildup in the heart vessels, that you do better than if you have a higher calcium score. And so even in the people that are the most fit, we still see this effect. So if you have a calcium score that is higher, we do see that your risk is slightly elevated. So does this mean that every athlete should have a coronary calcium score? Absolutely not. I think the most important is to look at risk factors, as I mentioned earlier. And that's mainly the story I wanted to bring to you today. So our data and data of other studies have shown that years of intense training, I should say actually high duration training, can lead to coronary heart clogging. But, and that is really important, it doesn't mean higher risk of heart attacks. Heart disease still is, though, the #1 cause of sudden cardiac death in athletes over 35. And we should, as all individuals, know our risks, and especially if we have symptoms, we should talk to our physician and have a check. And we should look for risk factors. And it's not because you're an athlete that we should ignore high blood pressure or high cholesterol, because those are really the lifestyle factors we can modulate and also modulate our risk. And here I would like to thank, as André pointed out, all of the collaborators, friends, and colleagues over the last years. And you really see the fruitful collaboration between Belgium and Australia. Even Belgians think they can do surfing, etc. But so thank you.
Thank you very much. So, as said before, I'm just going to shake Guido's hand and let him run because it's a tight timeline. And I'll take questions because I can't do Guido's study as much justice as himself, but I'm happy to take the questions. So, thank you very much, and safe travels. And give Marlies a hug again from me. Very good. So we'll move. What I'll do is I'll take the questions at the end along the lines of everything. I'm going to move on to now for my talk. I'm very happy for this to be blood sport. So you can put your hand up and ask me for questions at any time if you require clarification. If you get really bored and annoyed, then walk out. If you want to walk out at the end, or even before, there's wine and some refreshments sort of down and round the corner. I will be a little upset if you walk out early and I find that you've got too stuck into the wine, because that's not the general gist. But thank you, Sava. I'm going to be speaking predominantly about the what we call the ProAF heart study, looking at atrial fibrillation, and I'll explain all of these things as we go along. But I'm also going to be really advertising some of the work going on in our lab beyond just the AF heart study. So this is the lab at a Christmas party, and I'll be referencing each of those as we go along. I wanted to start with a story that puts everything in context. So some of you might know Derek Clayton, or know of Derek Clayton, or know Derek Clayton because he's a local, and he set the world record for the marathon of 2:08 back in 1969. Another with a bit of a Belgian touch. He set that record in Antwerp in Belgium, and he a year later had some testing of his heart and fitness. And then he was tested again in 1991. And then Mark Hargraves contacted us and said, "Will you have a look at Derek Clayton? Because he was a legend and he's still a legend, and we think he's going to break all your records." So we got Derek through. And just to give you an idea of Derek Clayton, because he is a bit unique, this is his running diary. And here is his, and you might be able to read this, but I'll explain it. This is his mileage in the morning, and then he'd do his second run, and this is his mileage in the afternoon, not kilometers, but miles. So in the morning, he might run 7, he might run 14 miles. What's that? 12, 20 kilometers. And then in the afternoon, he might run 27 miles. 26 miles is a marathon. And then he keeps a column, which is his daily total. 35 miles, 27, 26, 27. A marathon is 26. So in total, he's running well over 200 miles a week, 320 kilometers. I have never seen anyone run this much. And maybe that's what it takes to set a world record. But also, there's a guy in America, a runner who rides for Runner's World named Amby Burfoot. And he once said, "I don't run to add years to my life. I run to add life to my years." I love the saying because really that's what exercise and sport is about. And here's Derek Clayton with these blue rectangles. That's his VO2 max. What's VO2 max? It's how much oxygen your body can use when you're exercising, and it's our gold standard measure of fitness. But it's also a really good measure of what we call functional capacity. And this here, 18 mils per minute per kilogram, is roughly the amount of oxygen required to be able to walk up 2 flights of stairs without having to stop, or pick up your groceries and walk up the stairs, or do all the things that you want to do. And below that, we call that sort of functional disability. It means that doing simple things, you get short of breath and have to stop. And the average person, this line, will hit that somewhere around 85, 90 years of age. More and more, because we're playing more and more computer games and doing whatever, and the population perhaps is not as fit as it once was, you can hit that threshold at the age of 50 or 60. We calculated that Derek Clayton, now 82 years of age, will hit that at nearly 130. So you roughly lose 1 mil per minute per kilogram per year. And so, a lot of people here will have had their fitness tested and will know their VO2. And if you don't, you can go back and have a look at your little document that Amy might have sent you. And you can sort of get an idea as to where that sits. But that is one of the key things, because in the newspaper, people say, if you exercise, do you get less cancer? If you exercise, you lower your risk of diabetes or stroke. And all of those things are lower. But there's also some randomness about that. You can be the fittest person and have a heart attack. But the thing you can guarantee yourself about is if you do the exercise, you will maintain capacity and you will have the life that you want to live. And I put that up because it's really the most important thing if you want to take a key message from everything. Now, the other thing we see with someone who's setting a world record is that their heart's big. We know that heart size correlates with capacity. And Derek Clayton's fitness was off the charts, so we'd expect his heart size to be off the charts. And that's exactly what we see. These are his heart on MRI scan and his volumes. So 300 mils, normal ventricles are around 140 mils. So it's more than twice as big. And these dots here are average normal heart, normal endurance athlete heart, Derek Clayton. So sort of far lap stuff. Now his atria, which are these priming chambers of the heart, are enormous. So we would normally regard roughly 50 mil per meter squared as being severely dilated. And here's a severely, severely, severely dilated. And the question then is he going to get atrial fibrillation? What is atrial fibrillation? That's a heart rhythm problem that comes from these priming chambers, usually starting as a few irritable cells, and then it can sort of take over the atria. It is never a life-threatening arrhythmia. When you read about people who have died in the newspaper, it's not because of atrial fibrillation, but it can be a royal pain in the bum. Some people hate the feeling when they go into atrial fibrillation. Some people, they feel like their exercise tolerance is reduced. It can be a risk factor for heart failure, meaning being more short of breath and the heart not working properly. Now, having said that, I have not seen that in athletic populations. The main thing we worry about is its association with stroke, and some people with atrial fibrillation need to be on blood thinners so that the risk is lower.
Do you think he's off the chart because of the exercise, or do you think he was able to do the exercise because he was genetically off the chart?
So, very good question, and that's one of the things we're working on. I think a bit of both. So I think people are born with the genetics that enable their heart to, if we take 100 people and we train them all, some people are non-responders. They don't get much fitter and their hearts don't get bigger. And other people, they get much fitter and their hearts get much bigger. And I think that that's genetic. But if we just scan a whole bunch of people who haven't done much exercise, we can't pick those people. It's sort of like you need the exercise stimulus, and those with the genetics, it all dilates. So I think Derek could have had a normal sized heart if he'd done nothing, but he trained and got a supersized heart, got super fit, set world records, and they all kind of go together. And then so the suspicion here with really big atria is that he might get atrial fibrillation. These are the sort of graphs, or sort of pictures, I should say, a doctor gives you after you've gone in and had an ablation for atrial fibrillation, because Derek Clayton did develop atrial fibrillation. He sort of found that he could no longer, when he went into AF, he said, "It's no good, I can't keep up with the other people in the bike group." I said, "Derek, how old are they?" And he said, "They're 40. What's that matter?" So he had mild symptoms. He had an ablation and it didn't work. He had another ablation and it worked for a short period of time. And he's not in trade. I mean, he's still the fittest 82-year-old going around. And I don't lose sleep over Derek Clayton. But this is one of the potential side effects and one of the things that we're looking at with our research. And that brings me to the ProAF heart study that a number of you were involved in. And this also shows how many people, both locally and around the world, are required to do this sort of research. But we wanted to ask two things. Do endurance athletes get more atrial fibrillation? And to try to get a bit of an insight into what the causes are. We chose rowers. This is sort of the main graphic that came with the paper. This was published in a journal called the European Heart Journal, which at the moment is the highest impact cardiovascular journal. So we were excited that it got published with when it gets published in a big journal, there's sort of more reach, more people read it and these sort of things. The reason we chose rowers was because Andy Guerin and some people in the rowing community, well, particularly Andy Guerin, keeps a record of everyone who's rowed for Australia at a national or international level. And so we therefore knew how many people that would be between the age of 45 and 80. I can't remember exactly what years that was, sort of inclusion in competition. But so that was the age group that we were looking at, and we knew how many people from Victoria raced at those levels, and we could try to contact all of those people, and then from those we got 121 rowers who we could study. And we compared that to the UK Biobank, which is a massive number of people, but we were able to match against just over 11,000 people who had had an MRI scan and rhythm monitoring, so we knew who could get atrial fibrillation. And we could match exactly for age and gender, and it had the same sort of socio-economic status, etc. And don't worry about the bottom here, because I'm going to go into each of those in part. So this was the general gist, 121 versus 11,500. Different ranges of success, if you like, in the rowing, but including 23 Olympians, 27 World Championships, some Olympic gold medals, silver, bronze, etc. This is cream of the crop, many of whom you know or are. And this was the take-home message. So Dara Flannery is the PhD student who primarily ran this study. Dara was going to come, but don't see him in the audience. But Dara Flannery and Rodrigo Canovas, who was a bioinformatician who helped out enormously with the study, as did the rest of the team. This is the key finding. If we look at the UK Biobank, which is a big population, just like if we took a sample of Melbourne, and this matches what we know, which is that at an average age of 61 years, about 3%, 3 in 100 people will have atrial fibrillation. In our rowers at the same age, it was 21%, 1 in 5, or 7 times more than in the general population. We thought we would see more AF. We were a bit knocked over by just how much AF we saw in the rowing community. Now, if you take 121 and then take 21% out of that, you're left with only just under 100 athletes. And in just under 100 athletes in 5 years of follow-up, even in that small number, we could show that more people developed AF for the first time, what we call incident AF, it's these cases, then got new AF in the UK Biobank. So in other words, when we looked at the rowers, we found that 1 in 5 athletes had AF, and those who didn't were more likely to get AF in the next period of time. We could divide the population up into those people who were elite rowers and never stopped, in various endurance sports, rowing or whatever, and then people who were, world champion rowers and then hung up the oars and really had a pretty normal life. And we didn't find any difference. So it was almost, if you rowed at an amazing level in your 20s and early 30s, whether you retired or not didn't have a big impact on whether or not you got AF, which was also a new finding. Now, this is some of the fancy things we can do. I'll explain these graphs. But firstly, this is Diane Fatkin at the top over here, who is one of the scientists we work very closely with from Victor Chang in Sydney. And down the bottom is Paul Lacaze, who's one of the main genetic people at Monash University. So our thanks to their help for this sort of research. But these are called polygenic risk scores. Now, what this means is that when we look at people's genetics, there's some conditions where a single mutation can cause a big problem. So we have some heart conditions, for example, where a single mutation can cause the condition. This is not that. This is more, so for example, if we have families that are tall, there is not a tall gene. We can't look for the tall gene, but we can look at your whole genetic picture and look at the little variations and see whether you're more likely to be tall or short. This is the same concept. We take a whole lot of genes, thousands of genes, and we know the associations from those genes with atrial fibrillation, and we can say whether you're more likely or less likely to get AF. So this is the rowing population, and these are the people with atrial fibrillation. And this is when we take their genes and we give them a score for their genetic risk of having the condition. And then how wide this is how many people, sort of the distribution. So there's a small number of people with a really high risk, a small number of people with a really low risk, and most people are around the middle. And the way we look at this is often to assign, who's in the upper 1/4 or the upper upper 10%. We look at the extremes because it tells us more. And as you can probably see, in the rowers with atrial fibrillation, there's many more in this high risk sort of group in the upper quartile than in those who don't have AF. Now, in the general population, we saw exactly the same thing. So what that means is we could work out who was more likely to get AF or not, but it was no different in the athletes from the general population. It was a somewhat useful tool in everyone, but it was about the same. So it didn't explain why the athletes were 7 times more likely. So genes are something, but it doesn't explain why athletes are so much different. And we think that it's more related to the big hours of exercise training. And as you just heard from Professor Claassen, probably more about the hours of training that have been done. So conclusion from that study, AF was 7 times more likely in elite rowers. It didn't matter whether people were still rowing or doing exercise or not. There was a genetic contribution in both athletes and non-athletes, and it didn't explain that big difference. And in other words, it was a combination of both exercise and genetics, but mostly exercise that seemed to explain this big difference. But I would circle right back to my story of Derek Clayton, because even though this is an important finding, it doesn't tell us whether someone's healthy or not, because, virtually everyone now study were the healthiest people walking through the door, and atrial fibrillation was a little sting in the tail or a little pain in the bum rather than a major health problem. So then I would be saying, okay, so 1 in 5 is going to get AF, but who's that? Because there's people who will and won't. And this is Luke Spencer at the top left there, who's one of our PhD students who's sitting up the back. And so I threw Luke the challenge and said, you tell me out of our population who's got AF and who doesn't, using all of our measures and things. And so Luke went through and he looked at the ultrasounds of the atria, as I showed before, whether they were big, looked at the ECGs, looked at the Holter monitor data, and found that there are a whole lot of those measures that could pick the difference between those with AF and those without. But no one measure, there was not a single measure that was good enough at telling us. But if you added them together and gave them sort of a score, with this sort of, we call it a receiver operator curve, but basically 85% of the time, Luke could pick whether someone was going to have AF or not if he took all of those things put together. And so at the moment, we're putting that together into a website where people can go in and enter their measurements, or the cardiologist can, and try to work out whether someone's more likely or less likely to get AF. We haven't published that yet, but I think that's going to be important. And why is that important? Because people now can wear an Apple Watch, or in fact, all the brands, Apple, Garmin, Samsung, a lot of them can do an ECG and tell you reasonably accurately whether you've got atrial fibrillation. And we think that, for example, if you're an ex-elite rower, the risks are getting up there in terms of possibly getting AF. And it would be good to know, because sometimes if you've got other things like high blood pressure or other things, then we would be saying it'd be good to be on blood thinners so you don't get a stroke. And you don't want a stroke to be the first indication that or the first time that you know that you're in AF. And this might help further, because if you have the right, if the doctor can click in your things and say, oh, gee, you don't have AF, but you're really at higher risk, then they might be saying, go and get yourself a watch that can tell you if you go into AF. So that's really and I'll get to that at the end, because what I see our lab as doing is not, the emphasis is on how healthy people are who exercise, but we want to make it as safe as possible for everyone to exercise as much as they want. So the other question that comes up is slight variation on the theme, but who will get a pacemaker? Who will need a pacemaker? And this is Paolo D'Ambrosio, who's a PhD student who's up at Newcastle at the moment, so he's not here. But he looked at how many people have really low heart rates and whether that means that you need a pacemaker. And I'll just show some of the results, but nearly 500 elite athletes. This is no longer just rowers. This is from young to old. And 40% of those people had a resting heart rate under 40, so really very slow. You might see when you watch the Tour de France, sort of people saying, oh, Jan Ulrich's heart rate, or I think it was Miguel Indurain's heart rate was 28, and people wear a badge of pride how low their heart rate was. It's actually reasonably rare. 3% of elite athletes have a heart rate that's super low, under 30 beats per minute. Similarly, we see gaps, particularly when people are sleeping, pauses, and it's reasonably uncommon for that to be longer than 3 seconds. So they're helpful things for us to know when we're looking at what is normal for athletes and who needs a pacemaker. Now, of our 465 endurance athletes, even in these people that were really slow, none of them needed a pacemaker. So we don't think that this is a sort of important finding. Now, one thing that came out of this, though, because before I told you about an atrial fibrillation polygenic risk score, so these scores associated with AF, we have these polygenic risk scores these days for just about everything, and one of them is for heart rate. And so the same people helping us with this, but this really surprised me. So here's the athletes with a heart rate over 40, and here's those with a heart rate under 40. The lower you score, the more associated it is with a low heart rate. And so we thought we would see a lower score in those with a lower heart rate, a genetic contribution to having a low heart rate. The bit that we were really surprised by and we don't completely understand is if you take all of the athletes together, their score was lower than the general population. And what that seems to suggest is that somehow athletes are genetically more likely to have a low heart rate. And it's almost like if you're genetically primed to have a low heart rate, you're more likely to be an athlete. So somehow this might actually be a signature of your likelihood of being more likely to be a superstar. We're doing some more work on this. Now, some of you, this is to highlight some work of Crystal Janssens, who's somewhere just outside. Crystal ran her first marathon this year. Some of you will have met Crystal through our research program. She's one of our favourite people in the team and was very proud to run her first marathon. And she might have strapped a blood pressure monitor on some of you to measure blood pressure over 24 hours. This was simply when we go to conferences, people say, of course they get atrial fibrillation. Their blood pressure goes up too much during exercise. But in fact, what all these dots mean, this is measuring the blood pressure multiple times through exercise. And the bottom line of all of this is that when we compared those people with AF and without, athletes with and without AF, the blood pressures were identical. These lines are virtually superimposed, just as fit, just as high blood pressure, no difference. So the blood pressures in athletes in all of us go up with exercise and get very high in athletes, but does not explain the AF story. I'm going to change gears a little bit. I like to highlight this case. We have this is now getting off AF and getting into heart rhythm problems that actually can be very serious. Also highlight this because this is the furthest a patient has travelled to see me, and he came over from California. And this heart rhythm problem, I know there's a couple of people in the audience who have had similar, but this is ventricular tachycardia. So unlike atrial arrhythmias, where it's always safe, ventricular arrhythmias affecting the main pumping chambers of the heart, that can be more unstable and can be very serious. And so this is a heart rhythm where we always investigate and investigate intensively. And one of the tests we do is an MRI scan. And this is the heart muscle. Black is good. White can be inflammation or scar. And this little line here means that there's some scar on the outside of the heart. And we've come to learn about some of the patterns that are associated with athletes in this arrhythmia, and they're quite distinctive. But again, it's in a way, it's only through seeing big groups of athletes we start to understand this. And it's much less common than atrial fibrillation, but potentially much more serious. Now, I don't have all the answers for this yet, but I just want to highlight some of the important work being done in the lab in terms of this and what causes ventricular tachycardia. And what we think about in the general community is, does this mean, coming back to that genetic question, does this mean they actually have one of those rare genes that is associated with heart conditions? And Amy, who's standing over there, Amy won the genetics prize at our major national meeting for this work, showing that in nearly 500 athletes, if we look at all of the genes, we actually find serious genes in less than 2% of people. And in most of those, there actually wasn't much heart disease. But when we look at the genes, because unfortunately, it's not like we don't get a report that says all good, all bad. We get either bad, good, or not sure. We call that not sure, variant of uncertain significance, because we all have sort of variants, just like some people have big nose or big ears. We have in our genes, there's things that make us all different. And a lot of those we don't fully understand. So based on this, at the moment, we would say the worst thing we could do is to go out to all athletes and just start doing genetic testing, because we won't find many problems, and we'll find a whole lot where we call, one of my colleagues calls it genetic purgatory. We just end up with this indecision, and it's really difficult for patients and the doctors. So we don't have answers here yet, but we're doing a lot of work, and this is really important because it is guiding the way we practice our medicine. Now, probably one of the other really important things looking out at the audience is that a lot of what I've said today has been predominantly about men. And in fact, the work that Guido, which he didn't mention, about the coronary disease, that 600 population was all men. And one of the things in sports cardiology is that we've been very guilty of being a bit focused on men. And so Steph Rowe, who's here at the back, has done some work to address that and said, what about the women? And there has been a thought that this athlete's heart, the heart getting bigger with exercise, happens much more in men than in women. But in fact, when we looked at heart size relative to fitness, it was the same in men and women. And especially if instead of just saying fitness relative to body surface area, because men and women have different body surface composition, if we did it to just what FFM means, free fat-free mass, which is also essentially muscle. So if you do heart size and correct for muscle, men and women are the same. So the only other thing I would say to that is, interestingly, atrial fibrillation, ventricular tachycardia, all these electrical things are at least 5 times less likely in women. So the bottom line here at the moment is I'd say women are just as fit as men when you, or hang on, that's not true actually. Women can be, for the heart adaptations to fitness are the same as in men, but their risk of heart rhythm problems is much less. Women are more stable in general.
Pretty bad.
So I'm going to leave things there and leave it for questions. So, you know, again, a plug for our lab, because if we look at our sort of outputs and our metrics up against some of the big groups around the world, the Americans, we like to beat the Americans, especially at the moment, and I'm even worried they're going to start putting tariffs on us. If we compare ourselves to the Norwegians, the Italians, some of the big groups around the world, over the last 4 years, we've had substantially more sort of publications and findings and sort of, I'd say, contributions. This is in atrial fibrillation. It's in working out whether a given heart is normal for an athlete or has disease, ventricular arrhythmias and sudden death and genetics. So some of the biomarkers with heart muscle indicators and inflammation that I haven't talked about. And as Guido talked about right at the beginning, you know, particularly the work in Belgium in coronary artery disease. So it's really big impact. And as I said, this is really our goal, which is making sport safe for everyone, because I really do want everyone to go home with the message, because like the coronary artery disease that Guido talked about earlier, we can do x-rays and we can find gunk in the arteries, and yet the risk of heart attack is lower. So, you know, what that tells us is that we shouldn't ignore the gunk in the arteries, because we can make you even more safe by using exercise in combination with medications. So it's not like we should bury our head in the sand and say athletes are never going to have a problem, you know, everything's good here. What we do is we can say, on average, athletes live longer. We know that. Athletes live better if we consider functional capacity. I won't go into everything else, but certainly in terms of being able to climb flights of stairs and everything. And you know, but even within that group on average, there are people that have atrial fibrillation, coronary disease, etc., that we can make even better by making sure that they don't have a heart attack, a stroke, etc., by identifying them and treating them. And that's really what I think is the most important thing for what we're doing. We're taking a group of people that have done all the right things, have contributed enormously to society in general, and we're trying to make sure that they have the same opportunity to have the best possible health that they can have.